Snow was still falling when Tatum Reyes pressed her back against the wall outside the conference room, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the third floor. And the moment she heard Callum's voice drop into that particular register, low, flat, deliberate, the one he only used when someone was about to regret something. She'd learned to read that voice the way she'd learned to read vitals, the slight narrowing of breath before a patient coded, the specific quality of silence in a room when the numbers stopped making sense. 14 months working at Hargrove Medical, 11 of them as Callum Voss's private physician on retainer, had taught her a great many things she hadn't asked to know. Through the glass partition, two men she didn't recognize were nodding at things she couldn't hear. Callum stood at the head of the table with his back to her, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides. The stillness of someone who'd never needed to perform authority because it was simply a fact about him, like height or bone structure. Her daughter was waiting at school pickup in 40 minutes. She should not be standing in this hallway. She should not have stayed late to drop off the revised blood work results in person when she could have sent them electronically, the way she'd done every other time in 11 months, the way any professional with good sense would have. But Rowan had a way of looking at her when she arrived that Tatum had stopped pretending she didn't notice. Just for a moment, before his face rearranged itself back into whatever expression billionaires wore when they weren't being watched. Just a flicker. Just enough. She was 43 seconds from turning around when the door opened. Callum Rowan filled the doorframe, 6'2" of controlled calm in charcoal wool, dark eyes landing on her with the precision of someone who never let his gaze land anywhere accidentally. "You've been standing there a while," he said. Not a question. An observation. Tatum lifted the folder. Blood work results. Her voice came out steadier than her hands. "Your assistant wasn't at her desk. She leaves at 5. He glanced at the folder, then back at her. "It's 6:40. I know what time it is." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth. She'd stopped expecting warmth from him months ago. More like acknowledgement that she'd played the game correctly, that she was still pretending, same as him. He stepped back. "Come in." The office smelled like wood smoke and something cold, glass and winter air seeping through windows that looked out over a Boston skyline going gray in the early dark. The two men were gone. She hadn't even seen them leave. Tatum set the folder on the desk. She kept her eyes on the blood work, not on the way Callum watched her cross the room, not on the fact that there were no chairs facing his desk, which meant she'd have to stand close to hand him the results, which meant she'd have to stand close. "Your ferritin's still low," she said. "I want to adjust the iron protocol, and your cortisol numbers are higher than they should be, which I've noted in the summary, and which you're going to ignore." "Probably. You haven't been sleeping." "I sleep. 4 hours isn't sleep, Mr. Rowan. It's postponing." He took the folder from her hands without opening it, and for a half second their fingers were an inch apart over paper, and she became very aware of her own heartbeat in a way she found professionally inconvenient. "How's your daughter?" he asked. The question caught her sideways. It always did when he asked, and he did ask sometimes in exactly that tone, careful, like he was handling something that mattered. "She's 6, Tatum said. "She's fine. She's better than either of us. She probably is." She started to reach for her coat from the chair where she'd dropped it. "Tatum." She stopped. Callum was looking at her with that particular intensity, the one she'd told herself was just how he looked at problems he was trying to solve, the one she'd told herself had nothing to do with her specifically. "Did you ever want this?" he asked quietly. "This arrangement. Working for me." She turned to face him fully. The question had never come up in 11 months. It felt strange now, like pressure changing before a storm. "It pays well," she said, "and Sophie needed stability after the divorce. So yes, I wanted it." "That's not what I asked." Tatum put her coat on slowly. "I think you know what I wanted, Mr. Rowan. I think you've known for a while. And I think we've both made very professional choices about what to do with that information." She left before he could answer. The hallway was empty. The elevator was slow. By the time she reached her car, her hands had stopped almost shaking, and she'd reminded herself 11 times that her daughter was waiting, that she was a grown woman with a child and a career, and no business developing feelings for a man who ran half the medical infrastructure of the northeastern United States and probably didn't experience feelings the way regular people did. She had forgotten, in her haste to remind herself of all these things, that she'd left her phone on his desk. She didn't go back. She told herself she'd get it in the morning. She told herself it was fine. The call came at 2 a.m. Not to her phone, to her landline, which only 3 people in the world had, and none of them were supposed to be Callum Rowan. "I need you to come in. It's 2 in the morning. I know what time it is." A pause. She heard something beneath the quiet of his voice. Not quite strain, but the edge of something being held very carefully. "I'm not calling about bloodwork." Tatum sat up in the dark. Sophie was sleeping down the hall. The nightlight under the door cast a thin line of yellow across the floor. "Are you hurt?" A longer pause this time. "There was an incident at the waterfront facility. 3 men. I handled it, but..." He stopped. "There's a situation I need medical help managing that cannot go through official channels." She should have said no. She should have said call a hospital, call a clinic, call anyone who isn't a single mother with a 6-year-old asleep down the hall and a professional line they'd somehow already blurred. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She called her neighbor, left Sophie a note with a drawing of a sun in case she woke up early, and drove through empty Boston streets in the kind of cold that felt personal. The building he'd directed her to wasn't his usual office. It was a townhouse near the waterfront, unassuming, dark. A man she'd never seen before met her at the door with an expression that suggested he'd been instructed not to ask questions, so she didn't either. Callum was in the kitchen, which was incongruously warm and ordinary-looking. White tile, a kettle on the stove, overhead lighting that made everything look too close and too real. He was sitting on the edge of the counter, shirt open at the collar, one hand pressed flat against his left side. "Show me," Tatum said. He moved his hand. She'd spent enough years in emergency medicine to look at wounds without reacting. This wasn't an emergency. 2 inches, clean edges, not deep enough to worry about organs. Someone had been aiming to scare more than damage. "You'll live," she said, and opened her bag. Good to know. She worked without talking for a while, cleaned, clothes, dressed. His breathing stayed even. He didn't wince. She didn't ask him to explain, and he didn't volunteer anything. And somewhere in the quiet of that kitchen, something shifted between them that she couldn't account for by the time she was done. She pressed a piece of tape down over the dressing. Her hand stayed there a half-second too long. Tatum. She didn't look up. "Don't. I wasn't going to say anything inappropriate. Then what were you going to say?" A pause. "Thank you." She looked up then. He was watching her with the careful look she'd spent 11 months cataloging and pretending she hadn't, and he was close enough that she could see that it wasn't a professional expression. It had never been a professional expression. She'd just been very committed to pretending otherwise. "I'm going home," she said. "You need to sleep and you won't, and your cortisol is going to look terrible in next month's results." Probably. Callum. It was the first time she'd said his name without the Mr. in front of it, at least out loud. They both noticed. Neither of them acknowledged it. "I know," he said quietly. She drove home through streets that were still empty. Sophie was still sleeping. The nightlight was still on. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, which was a fact about the world that she needed to be true right now. She sat in the parking garage for 7 minutes before going upstairs, because she needed those 7 minutes to rebuild the distance that had somehow dissolved in a warm kitchen at 3 in the morning, and she couldn't do it while moving. She was almost successful. 3 days later, Tatum arrived at the office to find her keycard access revoked, not gradually, not with a conversation, just stopped working. She stood in the lobby with her badge against the reader, and the light stayed red, and the receptionist she'd passed every morning for 11 months looked at his screen and said, very professionally, that he'd been informed her services were no longer required. She stood on the sidewalk in February air for a full minute before her hands stopped feeling numb enough to hold her phone. No email, no call, no explanation. She'd treated his wound 3 days ago in a kitchen that smelled like winter and coffee, and now she didn't have a job. She called his office line. It went to voicemail. She called his cell. A different voice answered, someone she'd never spoken to, professionally warm, telling her that Mr. Rowan appreciated her service and that a severance package had been wired to the account on file and that no further communication would be necessary. Tatum stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to her car, sat down, and called her sister. "I need you to watch Sophie tonight," she said. "Why? What happened?" "I have to figure out why I just lost my job and my access to a building, and also apparently my ability to make good professional decisions, and I'd rather not do that in front of a 6-year-old. There was a pause. "Tam, what did you do?" "Nothing," she said, which was true. Nothing at all. That's almost worse. She spent that evening updating her CV and not looking at her phone and not allowing herself to feel anything about the fact that 6 words, "No further communication will be necessary," delivered by a stranger's voice, had managed to do what 11 months of careful professionalism hadn't, made absolutely clear what she'd been worth to Callum Rowan. Nothing. Leverage, maybe. Company policy. A liability. Whatever category. A physician who showed up at 3 in the morning and stayed too long and started using first names fell into. She cleaned the kitchen instead of crying. She was very thorough. She found out why 2 weeks later, not from Callum, but from a man she'd never met who knocked on her apartment door on a Tuesday afternoon while Sophie was at school. He identified himself as federal. He showed her a badge she was in no position to verify. He asked if she knew a man named Callum Rowan. She said yes. He asked if she'd treated any injuries outside of official medical settings in the past month. She said no, in a voice that she kept very steady. He looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Reyes, we're not interested in you. We're interested in the company he runs. Hargrove Medical has been under investigation for 18 months. Financial fraud, coercion of witnesses, potential violations of federal healthcare law. Mr. Rowan is the primary subject." Tatum held the doorframe. "I see. If he's made contact with you recently, outside of your former professional capacity, we'd want to know." "He hasn't," she said, which was technically true. The call at 2 a.m. had been professional in a manner of speaking. The agent left her a card. She put it face down on the kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a long time. Callum hadn't fired her to be cruel. He'd fired her to protect her, or to protect himself, or both. She wasn't sure those were different things. What she was sure of was that the keycard and the severance and the stranger's voice on his phone had been a door being shut firmly but not unkindly, and she'd been so busy feeling erased that she hadn't stopped to ask why. She picked up the agent's card. She put it in a drawer. She called the school to check on Sophie. Sophie was fine. 1st grade, painting something with too much blue, according to her teacher, which tracked. Tatum made tea. She thought about a kitchen at 3 in the morning. She thought about the way Callum's hand had covered hers, briefly, when she'd pressed down the last piece of dressing. She thought about the fact that she'd spent 11 months telling herself she didn't feel what she felt, and she'd wasted that time. And now there was a federal agent handing her business cards, and a man she couldn't call, and a wound she'd closed that apparently had more context than she'd been given. Her phone rang. Unknown number, Messrs. Reyes, not Callum's voice. Someone older, direct. "My name is Alderton. I work for Callum. He needs you to understand something. He could tell me himself. He can't call you directly right now." A pause. "He knows you were visited today. He wants you to know that everything he did, ending your contract, cutting contact, was to keep you outside of something you don't have clearance to be inside." "That's all. That's all," Tatum repeated. "He said you'd want more than that." "He was right." A longer pause. "He also said, and I'm reading this directly, that the answer to the question you asked him the night you left your phone on his desk is yes. He said you'd know what that means." Tatum sat very still. She'd asked him that evening in his office. She'd said, "I think you've known for a while." She hadn't been asking. She'd been stating. But the answer she hadn't expected was still the answer, apparently, and it was being delivered via intermediary at 4 in the afternoon while she stood in her kitchen, in her socks. "Tell him he should have said it himself," she said. "I'll pass that along." The line went dead. The second time a stranger knocked on her door. It was a Thursday morning, and Sophie was right there in the kitchen eating cereal, and Tatum's heart went sharp, and still in the way it did when something was wrong before she could name what. Two men. Not federal. She knew the difference now, not by badge but by posture, by the way they held themselves in a doorframe like they owned it and were being polite about it. "Dr. Reyes," the taller one said, "we'd like you to come with us." "I have a daughter," she said. "We know." He didn't say it like a threat. That was almost worse. "There'll be someone to stay with her. If you think I'm leaving my child with..." Tatum. Callum's voice, from somewhere behind the two men. She craned to look past them. He was at the far end of the hallway, coat on, face arranged into something that was trying hard to look calm and not quite getting there. "I'll explain in the car," he said, "but I need you to trust me, and I need Sophie to stay here for the next few hours. Roman's wife is already downstairs. She has a daughter the same age. They'll be safe." Tatum looked at him. She looked at Sophie, who was watching this entire interaction with the wide-eyed focus of a 6-year-old filing everything away for later analysis. "Mama's going out?" Sophie asked. "Mama's going out," Tatum said, in the voice she used when she needed things to feel normal, so Sophie would let them be normal. "To help a friend. New friend to play with, okay?" Sophie considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Will the new friend have snacks?" "I'll personally guarantee it," Callum said from the hallway. Sophie accepted this. In the car, black tinted, moving too fast through streets that Tatum didn't recognize, she said, "You're going to tell me everything. Yes, everything you should have told me 2 weeks ago. Yes, starting with why." Callum looked at her. There was something different about him in this light. More worn, less contained, like the winter he'd been imitating for 11 months had finally let some weather through. "The investigation has been going on longer than Hargrove Medical has existed," he said. "My father built the company on practices that I spent 12 years trying to dismantle from the inside. I knew the federal case was coming. I didn't know when. When the agent visited you." He stopped. "You were never supposed to be involved. You treated a wound that shouldn't have happened, in a location that's been surveilled for months. I cut contact to keep your name out of the files." "Noble," she said. And what? And what are we doing right now? Where are we going? Why do you have men with posture in my hallway on a Thursday morning?" The car slowed. Outside, a waterfront building she didn't recognize, glass and steel, 6 stories, one black van parked in front with its engine running. "Someone's been watching your building," Callum said. "Since the agents visited, not federal. The men who were at the waterfront the night you came to me, they're trying to find out what you know." "I don't know anything. They don't know that." Tatum absorbed this. "So what's the plan?" "Get you somewhere safe while I hand over the documentation to the federal team voluntarily, which I should have done months ago and chose not to for reasons that were correct at the time and are less correct in retrospect." "Less correct," she said. "That's one way to phrase it." "Tatum, I had a federal agent in my kitchen, Callum. I have a daughter. You should have told me. I know." Co-qualifier, no justification. Just "I know," in a voice that had no winter in it at all. She turned to look at him. He was watching the building outside, jaw set, and she could see it now, the weight he'd been carrying under all that stillness, all those months, all that careful professional distance. Not coldness. The opposite of coldness. Something he'd been holding very carefully because he didn't trust what would happen if he stopped. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay? I'm not saying I forgive you for the severance package conversation." She pulled her bag onto her lap. "I'm saying, what do you need me to do?" What followed was 6 hours she would spend years editing in her memory into something more linear. The safe location was a Hargrove Medical affiliate property 40 minutes outside Boston, which she found deeply ironic. 2 of Callum's people drove them separately. He sat across from her in a conference room that had been hastily converted into something that felt like a waiting room for a very particular kind of reckoning, and he walked her through 12 years in an hour and a half. The documentation was thorough. His father had been thorough, methodically building a company that served patients on the surface and extracted money and favors and leverage beneath it, a machine of quiet corruption running parallel to legitimate medicine. Callum had spent his entire adult career documenting it from inside, because leaving would have meant abandoning the patients who needed the infrastructure that still existed, and turning it over too early would have meant inadequate evidence. And he'd been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had kept not arriving. "My father died 8 months ago," he said. "That was the right moment." 8 months ago, Tatum said carefully. 3 months before I hired you. She looked at him. "So when you hired me, I needed a physician I could trust. Someone outside the company's existing network." He paused. "Someone who was good." That's a very professional reason. It was a very professional decision. And when did it stop being professional? The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere Boston was doing whatever Boston did in February, gray and relentless, indifferent to drama of any kind. "January," he said. "When you told me my 4 hours wasn't sleep. No one has said something that's straightforward to me in years." A pause. "Possibly ever." Tatum felt something loosen in her chest that she'd been keeping very tight for quite some time. "Your cortisol is still terrible," she said. "I know. When this is over." "When this is over," he said, "I was hoping you'd agree to have dinner with me. Somewhere that isn't a kitchen at 3 a.m. and doesn't involve a wound." "Dinner," she repeated. "A meal in a restaurant with no medical paperwork." He looked at her with the expression she'd spent 11 months pretending she hadn't memorized. "If you're interested." She thought about the 20 minutes in a parking garage rebuilding distance. She thought about the nightlight under Sophie's door. She thought about a man who'd fired her to keep her safe and arranged a play date for her daughter before breakfast, and had apparently been holding something in reserve since January and was doing a genuinely terrible job of holding it now. "I'm interested," she said. "I want to be clear that this does not mean I'm not still angry about the severance. Understood. And you're going to need to meet Sophie formally. She'll have opinions." "She seemed like she would," he said. "I liked that about her." The federal handover took 2 more weeks, which Tatum spent in the affiliate property outside the city with Sophie, her sister, and a rotating cast of people. She eventually stopped asking to explain who they were. Sophie declared 2 of them her best friends and made one of them learn how to braid hair, which he did with the focused patience of a man unaccustomed to the task and unwilling to fail at it. Callum called every evening, not to explain, not to negotiate, just to ask about Sophie's blue paintings and whether the coffee was acceptable, and once, unexpectedly, to read Tatum an article about a clinic in Vermont that was doing interesting things with rural healthcare access, as if they were just 2 people with things to tell each other, which, apparently, they were. The charges came down on a Tuesday, not against Callum, against 6 executives, 3 board members, and a financial framework that had been running since before either of them was old enough to have opinions about it. Callum was named a cooperating witness. His name would be in papers she'd probably spend years not reading. He drove out to get them himself the next morning. Sophie was already awake, sitting on the porch steps in a coat 2 sizes too big that belonged to someone named Gerald, eating a piece of toast and watching the driveway like she'd scheduled this. Callum parked, walked to the porch, crouched down to Sophie's level in an expensive coat that was going to collect toast crumbs, and did not appear to mind. "You're the friend," Sophie said. "I'm the friend," Callum agreed. "You were gone a long time. Mama was grumpy." "Sophie," Tatum said. "She was, though." Callum looked up at Tatum with an expression she no longer had any particular desire to analyze or to contain, or pretend she hadn't been waiting to see in non-professional light for the better part of a year. "I was grumpy," Tatum confirmed. "Let's go inside." They didn't talk about what came next until after dinner, after Sophie was asleep, after the affiliate property had gone quiet in the specific way that buildings do when they've been emergency housing for 2 weeks and suddenly aren't anymore. Tatum sat at the kitchen table. Callum sat across from her. 2 cups of coffee that were better than the previous 2 weeks' supply of coffee, which was a low bar but still. "So," she said. "So, what does normal look like for you?" He considered this like it was a real question, which it was. "I don't have a reference point," he said honestly. "I've been inside this thing since I was 23. I don't know what I do when I'm not managing it." "You learn," Tatum said. It turns out poorly at first. You burn toast. You forget to sleep properly anyway, even when the cortisol normalizes. You have to trust your physician. You really do, she said. She's going to be very firm about that. He reached across the table. His hand covered hers the way it had in a kitchen in February, not brief this time, not accidental, just there, warm and deliberate and not going anywhere. I should have said it in person, he said quietly. The answer, not through an intermediary. Yes, I was trying to keep you safe. I know I'm going to get better at not making that call alone. She turned her hand over under his. I know that too. Outside, snow was starting again, softer than February, less aggressive, the kind that fell in late March like it was apologizing for the months before it. Sophie would see it in the morning and want to stand in it in her socks. And Tatum would say no, and Sophie would do it anyway for 30 seconds and come back inside, victorious and cold and holy herself. Callum was watching her face. What are you thinking about? Sophie's socks, she said. He laughed. Actually laughed, the kind she suspected he didn't do in boardrooms, open and a little surprised by itself. It changed his whole face into something she liked very much. Stay, she said. I mean, don't drive back tonight. There are rooms. Is that professional advice? It is not, she said. Not even slightly. He stayed. In the morning, Sophie found him already awake in the kitchen, attempting scrambled eggs with the methodical focus of someone who had access to extraordinary resources and had not, until recently, applied any of them to cooking breakfast. Sophie sat on the counter beside him and offered corrections. He took them seriously. The eggs were, in the end, fine, not excellent, fine, and they ate them at the table with toast that was only slightly burned, and outside the snow was melting already in thin lines along the driveway. And Sophie talked about her blue paintings for 11 uninterrupted minutes, and Callum listened like it was a briefing. Tatum drank her coffee, watched them, let herself feel what she'd been not allowing herself to feel for the better part of a year, which turned out to be quite a lot, which she supposed made sense given what she'd been storing. They drove back to Boston that afternoon. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat with her forehead against the window and her coat bunched up under her chin. Boston came back slowly. Familiar streets, familiar gray, the particular light that meant late March was trying. Callum reached across the center console without looking away from the road. Tatum let him take her hand. They didn't talk for a long time, and that was fine, because some things didn't need to be said yet. Some things just needed to be happening quietly, in the ordinary light of an afternoon that wasn't emergency or crisis or carefully maintained professional distance. Just a man and a woman and a sleeping child and a road going home. A life that was going to be strange and imperfect and occasionally complicated in ways they hadn't invented yet, built out of everything they'd survived to get here, which wasn't nothing. Which was, in fact, enough to start with. More than enough.